Caitlyn and her incredible shot are seen throughout League of Legends lore and history. Most of Piltover knows about her ability to take perfect shots every time, and it's demonstrated nicely in Warriors and more recently Arcane. And so today, we shine the competitive spotlight on Caitlyn, the Sheriff of Piltover.
Sorry boys, I keep the fuzzy cuffs at home.
Caitlyn has had a presence in competitive league since Season 1 Worlds at DreamHack, appearing in 4 of the 28 games held there. The meta was really undefined back then, and Caitlyn had to contend with bot lanes including Garen, Irelia and Poppy. Lee Sin even found himself playing in bot lane. However, the ADC role was dominated by both Corki and Vayne in 20 games, with Corki's mixed damage being far more valuable in bot, mid and top, and Vayne bringing true damage. Caitlyn just couldn't match the mixed damage that they brought. Caitlyn typically built an Infinity Edge into Bloodthirster, into Phantom Dancer and Last Whisper, and so even back then her build path was focused on crit for both bot and mid lane. But with the utility that Ashe brought, Caitlyn wasn't even the best choice for that. Caitlyn could thankfully flex into top lane, but the meta was such a mess that so could every other ADC. Unfortunately, the game she did show up in all ended as a loss, and as such, overall, Caitlyn wasn't huge for Season 1. Season 2 brought a whole bunch of assassins to plague ADCs, but thankfully Rengar and Kha'Zix were both disabled for Worlds 2012. That said, with a meta forming and hard CC engaged supports like Alistar and Leona running rampant, ADCs faced a real challenge. Newcomer Graves had also made a splash with his Sakaar and surprising bulk for an ADC, but none could have been ready for Ezreal. A buff to his mana consumption on QE and ult, and an increase in his AP ratios, meant that he brought huge mixed damage, incredible mobility, global match pressure, and newly added vision to his ult. Trinity Force back then gave AP, AD, crit, mana, health, and attack speed. With this combined, Ezreal was the ADC to watch, and Caitlyn, much like other pure crit ADCs, dropped so far out of relevance that Ashe wasn't even seen at Worlds. Caitlyn, however, did manage to find a small niche, where she found herself in 3 games taking a victory away from the mighty Ezreal using her lane bullying powers, with the range and Q that really dealt with most things effectively. All in all, there was far too much mixed damage coming from most ADCs for Caitlyn to remain relevant in Season 2. The break between Season 2 and 3 had some of the biggest meta shifts around the map. The addition of Zed, Elise and Thresh meant that mobility had become a necessity unless you brought something unique to the table. Bot laners who didn't have the mobility of Ezreal or the range of Varus or the mixed damage of Corki fell far to the wayside. Although Corki and Ezreal did become slightly less desirable with Trinity Force nerfs, moving away from applying a slow through auto attacks to increasing the attacker's movement speed. It didn't stop Corki being picked and banned in over 90% of games, but it did create an opening for Caitlyn. With the 90 caliber net creating distance and guaranteeing a headshot along with traps protecting her flanks, Caitlyn became hard to gank and had the ability to create distance and an ult that could still provide damage from all the way across the map. Caitlyn saw action over 50% of the 63 games during Worlds 2013, following her typical crit build and boasting an impressive 60% win rate, the highest of all ADCs who saw more than 10 games. Caitlyn was absolutely uncontrollable when held by Imp or San, with both players averaging KDAs over 10. OMG San got his hands on Caitlyn early in the group stages and then had Caitlyn banned or picked away from him in almost every game that followed. Every time the OMG ADC took Caitlyn, they had a decisive victory. Imp was no different, finding an early game with the Sheriff before having a couple of games banned away. Imp didn't have the same priority as San though, often Sona and Thresh taking priority bans when Samsung had the blue side. Overall, Caitlyn's ability to poke, trade and disengage made her quite the threat during Season 3, and it showed very clearly in her stats. Season 4 left Caitlyn untouched with only small quality of life changes that increased the visibility of her snap traps. Doesn't make a big difference. But meanwhile, one of the oldest ADCs, Tristana, got some long overdue attention, receiving buff after buff after buff throughout the season. She shot up in popularity and was in nearly half of all games. Old rivals Ezreal and Corki both saw buffs over the year too, and all these changes just pushed Caitlyn out of the spotlight, but it was nothing compared to the new ADC on the block. Lucian was enabled for pro play during Worlds 2013 and almost immediately became the most dominant force. Lucian took nerf after nerf upon his release, but the mobility Lucian had made him nearly perfect, especially when combined with the new support Braum. And with this combination, Lucian didn't just push Caitlyn out of the spotlight, he pushed almost everyone out. Caitlyn only saw 2 games during 2014 Championship, unable to bring enough damage or tower control to meet the competition. With that said, Caitlyn did steal the spotlight away from Lucian, with Uzi stalling into Caitlyn's late game strength after a grueling hour-long match for Starhorn taking the win against the Tapai Assassins. Uzi was unable to repeat this result against Wild Turtle's Tristana, although typical of Uzi, he came out ahead on CS and Gold, but a very close Baron fight left left Tristana the only one alive, and her explosive charges made quick work of the Nexus turrets and closed the game out. Caitlyn still had strength and potential, but just couldn't compete for the role of ADC in Season 4. Similar to Season 4, Season 5 nearly left Caitlyn untouched. A small buff to her traps meant that headshots ignored 50% armor, but that was the only change to Piltover's lore. On the positive side of being ignored by Riot, Caitlyn wasn't being nerfed to the ground like Lucian, who following Worlds 2014 was completely removed from relevance. This didn't give Caitlyn the chance to shine she wanted though. Zorn's loose cannon had received a small change buffing her late game, and Jinx, now getting excited, would rip apart an entire team and just walk away. Well, run. Speaking of running away, Season 5 saw a resurgence of Sivir, her ult given even more mobility to the team. The lack of instant mobility on these two was alleviated with a few changes to supports and jungle meta, meaning the jungle had less damage and the supports could soak up more damage. Kalista had also jumped onto the battlefield, and her unique movement mechanic brought some really incredible kiting prowess, reducing some of the reliance on supports to protect her. All this does not mean that Caitlyn had no impact on Season 5, she only appeared in 5 games but all 5 were in the quarterfinals, with Caitlyn being a real threat to the top tier Jinx. This niche for Caitlyn allowed her to be insta-picked when Jinx was seen, easily able to bully her out of her lane, while Jinx had to spend mana to use rockets to even trade with Caitlyn. Both carries scaled pretty well into the late game as well. The strength Caitlyn had over Jinx in the early game is what really set them apart. Season 5 was also the year of Mordekaiser, and those who were there in Season 5 will remember the stronghold Mord had over League's bot lane, although being banned in 68 out of 73 games meant that he had little to no impact on Caitlyn's presence. Had the Iron Revenant got through more bans, Caitlyn may have seen a little more play with her long range and good neutral game. Season 6 brought with it a major marksman change. Huge numbers of items were adjusted, many ADCs received significant balance changes, and one group of ADCs that really benefited from this more than others were the crit ADCs. Crit ADCs soared in popularity throughout the season, and Caitlyn was the second most popular at Worlds 2016, out of only 7 ADCs worthy of selection. During the Marksman update, Caitlyn received buffs in her base stats, Headshot lost its armor penetration but now scaled with crit, her Q, the Piltover Peacemaker, had its base damage and AD scaling buffed, and Caitlyn's traps lost their negligible damage over time to increase the damage taken by those caught. Only Caitlyn's net saw any reduction to stats, with a reduction in damage, missile speed and dash distance. They also added a new voice line, where Caitlyn said boom, headshot, every time she shot her 6th shot, and this was a huge understatement, with the next buff reducing the number of attacks between headshots. Runons meant a headshot was every 2-ish auto attacks in a minion wave. Then there were further buffs to Caitlyn's traps and a reduction in cooldown for her net, and it left her in such a great spot for Worlds. But that wasn't even close to the positivity surrounding Piltover's finest. In the Marksman update, items given crit chance were buffed, Runons was buffed, Infinity Edge was buffed, the new Last Whisper items, Mortal Reminders and Lord's Dominics, were technically buffed, and it just meant Caitlyn could deal with tanks and squishy targets with just as much ease. All of these changes paled in comparison to the release of Rapid Fire Cannon. Caitlyn's already massive range was increased and damage was added on top of the headshots, which meant even running away from Caitlyn wasn't an option. Aurelion Sol had created stars that perfectly aligned for the Piltover Sheriff, with huge success through Season 6. Only Jhin stood above her, bringing ludicrous damage to his first Worlds appearance. And all of this comes without even mentioning the change to the support meta. Frost Queen's claim encouraged more mana hungry supports with range CC, Zyra, Nami, Karma. They all made it easier for Caitlyn to place her traps, land her nets and auto attack with safety. The cherry on top of this amazing cupcake was that Caitlyn dealt with Kalista really effectively, bullying her out of lane and even the tournament, ensuring that Kalista went from the most played ADC to having literally no presence at all. Season 6 was the season of crit marksman, and it was heavily defined by Caitlyn and her well-placed headshots. Season 7 saw Caitlyn fall into a really odd spot. The tank-heavy jungle meta had put a big spotlight on ADCs, resulting in regular bans of Xayah, Kog'Maw and Tristana. So even though Caitlyn was not the most valuable ADC by a long shot, she was seen in nearly a quarter of Worlds 2017. Caitlyn was known for pairing well with supports like Lulu and bullying enemy ADCs throughout the game, whilst transitioning well into the late game and dealing with tanks effectively. The final area Caitlyn excelled in was dealing with Janna. A huge priority went to Janna during Season 7, the late game prowess she had was unmatched. But Caitlyn could bully her in lane, or support Janna's weaker early game, allowing her to get into that late game powerhouse state. So overall, Season 7 was a weird one for Caitlyn. She certainly wasn't meta or worlds defining, but her niche was significant in dealing with late game threats like Kog'Maw, Twitch and Janna. Piltover's premier police officer had some numbers reshuffled, moving some damage into her late game in lieu of a weaker early and mid game, which saw a slow rise of Caitlyn play, peaking at 81% in patch 8.5. But a switch in damage scaling to crit chance caused a massive drop in Caitlyn play, that and the release of Kaisar, who burst on the Rift with huge build flexibility and a generally fantastic kit. Furthermore, Xayah received some buffs throughout the season, was notably better at disengage than Kate, so sadly, there was no opportunity for Caitlyn to take her shot at Worlds 2018. Season 9 brought in turret plating, which meant lane snowballing would be slowed down. This took away from the value Caitlyn brought by bullying lanes, and of course Kaisar and Xayah continue to dominate with huge presence, and both of them being unofficially named the most valuable ADCs in the game. With that said, Caitlyn was well known during the LCS regular season. She created a game plan that focused around bot lane in the early game, which went really well with picks like Kayle or Cassiopeia, sometimes both, which forced enemy attention bot whilst Kayle and Cassiopeia could just scale out of control. The other use for Caitlyn was combining with Morgana or big CC supports to try and deal with the Xayah and Rakan lanes. Ultimately, this didn't pay off on the world stage though. Caitlyn lost every single game she was in, and it was not a fantastic year for Piltover Sheriff. But Season 10 saw Caitlyn bursting out of her shell, becoming the third most popular ADC at Worlds. Kaisa was nerfed back in line over the season, and Xayah, well, Xayah got some buffs over the duration of the season, but we'll come back to this, don't worry. Caitlyn also got some buffs. She saw her base stats increase, which improved her early game bullying strength, and Jhin saw some buffs as well, but these sniper buffs weren't what led to their huge dominance. This world stage was the first that saw Senna. Senna shook the meta to its core. The flexibility that she brought to the role allowed for some strong CC lane partners, or just powerful fighters in general. Set, Tahm Kench, Wukong, they were all seen at her side in the bot lane. But alongside Senna being an incredible ADC, she could also flex into support and empower ADCs to new heights. Mix this with Lucian, who could flex mid or top, and there was so much uncertainty in the enemy team. And irrelevant of all of the buffs and nerfs, the thing that Caitlyn brought was safety. She could deal with these threats whilst keeping them at range and bullying out other common scaling carries like Ashe and Twitch. And it might seem strange to suddenly mention scaling carries, but they did have a place in the Season 10 meta as well. Assuming that they survived the early game against Senna and whoever she brought with her, scaling carries could then carry the game to an unstoppable position. So Ashe and Twitch did get some presence in this season as well. But Caitlyn, don't forget, could also scale well into the late game. The crit damage on her headshots was very valuable, and previously she had been improved for her crit builds. World Champion Ghost was particularly vicious on Caitlyn, seeing a targeted ban in the finals and securing the win with an Ornn-empowered Caitlyn/Pantheon bot lane, demonstrating the early game control and cleanly outranging Aphelios. Caitlyn was monumentally important to stabilising the meta during Season 10. Without her, Senna would have just completely ran wild, and the only real way to play against her was to bunker up and scale into the late game, which frankly is just boring to watch, boring to play. Caitlyn, with her incredible lane dominance and ability to scale, just filled that gap perfectly and stopped Senna completely running out of control. And without Caitlyn, Season 10 would have been a completely different landscape. Hugely important champion, hugely important for the season. The Season 11 item rework was not kind to Caitlyn, and it gave rise to a complete meta shift again, alongside the fact that Senna had her souls reworked, nerfed, buffed, however you want to work it. The ADC items implemented just did not support Caitlyn's playstyle. Caitlyn did see a small buff in the run-up to Worlds 2021, but the ADC items being Shieldbow, Gale Force, and Kraken Spell just didn't merge too well with her. Shieldbow's lifeline didn't really help Caitlyn. Once she'd thrown her E, she was either in or out, and Gale Force was good, but the short dash range didn't help with executes when she was ulting from the other side of the map. Kraken Slayer, although very prevalent in solo queue, has to be very situationally picked in pro play as people know how to play around it. It's the same reason that we don't see Vayne everywhere in pro play. On top of all that, the Gale Force dash increased the verbiage on immobile carries, giving them an extra dash. Jhin, Aphelios, and the previously forgotten Misfortune all took advantage of the item, which increased their kill potential and gave them more opportunity to reposition. Misfortune was devastating for this, with her ultimate just cascading over teamfights. Caitlyn didn't go forgotten all season though. She was picked away from Worlds to deal with Jhin when he appeared. However, the power level just wasn't enough to make Caitlyn have as much impact in the last World Series we saw. So, when we look at Caitlyn under a competitive spotlight, wow, what a roller coaster the Piltover Sheriff had. She's been both the centre of attention and the sad forgotten one on the sidelines. An absolutely monumental performance after the first major marksman update, seeing nearly 2/3 of Season 6. but sadly, the modern meta and new items caused Caitlyn to wind down a little. However, for those enjoying the pre-season solo queue at the moment, you'll know there's an absolutely killer Caitlyn build coming up, Lethality Kate. Taking Dark Harvest, Duskblade and Collector is having her ult just decimate the mid game. Mix that with a strong neutral game, ability to bully out and the range to easily proc Dark Harvest during laning phase, and you have an absolute monster that's almost impossible to deal with. However, how popular will that be in Worlds? Braum is everywhere, and his E obviously completely nullifies Caitlyn's ult. On top of that, Morgana's had a few little appearances here and there, and Sivir is always available. There's a lot of ways to deal with Caitlyn's ult, so I'm not sure how well that will carry over to the pro scene. On top of that, there's been some small buffs and nerfs to the AD items, so it'll be interesting to see where Caitlyn ends up. She's already seen some early Season 12 action by being banned in 8 games and picked in 3, but at this point, the pro scene's such a mess that we couldn't really comment on what she's going to be like. But what do you guys want to see to keep Caitlyn present for the next peak of her rollercoaster ride? I'd like to see more focus on her range advantage over other carries, but I'd love to hear more about what you all think. And who do you think the competitive spotlight should shine upon next? Let me know in the comments below. And with all that said, I'll see you next time.